the higher. He's the Most High, holy and eternal, King of all kings, the only true wise and living God, the Almighty. Well, hello. So coming on again today with a continuation in the series of videos we've been doing with regards to the Balfour Declaration. We are, as you know, as a ministry, as a people, making a thorough repudiation and revocation of this instrument. So we've been looking really in the previous series of videos we've done at how our land came to effectively be gifted to another people who say that they are the people, but we know that the Bible firmly refutes and says that they are not, by a British Foreign Secretary at the beginning of the 20th century, 1917, November 1917 to be precise. So we began by raising an indictment on a wider basis, really, than just the Balfour Declaration. Not only against this declaration, but more widely against Edom, against Western civilizations generally. Because we've come to understand, really, in our review, as we have been looking in our mega series, which has been published on our sister channel, Israel Diaspora Report, which is also published under that badge on this channel, at the experience of Yashralites in Europe over the past 2,000 years. So as we've come to understand, in 70 AD, a whole nation, the Yashralite peoples, were pushed into Europe, essentially. They were exiled into Europe. So at the conquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of our temple, we should understand that by the time of the destruction of the temple, I just, as an aside comment, like to say, the temple had stood, by the time of its destruction, for well over 1,000 years. So you would have thought that on that basis, that Edom would have felt it was worth preserving. But that wasn't the case. It was destroyed and rooted out to the very foundations. Perhaps they will say this was in part to actually quell the insurrection of many of our people, the Sakari particularly, who led a very successful campaign to defend it under siege and under extreme conditions of privation and famine for well over 4 years against the Romans before their ultimate defeat. But nevertheless, I just make that comment because we often hear that Edom are lovers of archaeology and of ancient things, but, well, it seems to be rather selective, really, in the way that does actually manifest itself. But anyway, as we were saying, we're making a thorough repudiation of not only the Balfour Declaration, but the wider injustice, really, that has been done to our peoples over the past 2,000 years, which still in many ways continues to perpetuate. And we will actually be taking this on a wider basis to not only make a formal declaration for some repair or some address to be made to this situation, and also recovery of our lands also and our territories. So this involves not only the lands that are currently deemed to be formerly Israel, but also the lands that Britain then subsequently also handed off to subsequent surrounding nations under Ishmael. So why are we saying that an indictment here is deserved against Edom for these things? Well, just off the top of my head, and I've done really no formal review or study really of this at all to make a thorough, list of things. It's just a few of the items off the top of my head. If I were to do that, I have a list as long as your arm. It would end up being genuinely an exegesis of at least 99 points, as we were previously discussing about the 99 thesis of Martin Luther, who nailed his objections to Roman Catholicism onto the actual door of a cathedral in Germany. But just off the top of my head, really. Okay, so the first point we've mentioned, the erasure, I can only call it, of an entire nation. Because as we have come to understand, in 70 AD, a whole nation was exiled into Europe. This would have been millions of people. And we've seen how those who didn't actually heed Yeshua's instruction to flee to the mountains, as he gave in Luke chapter 21, were then rounded up by the Romans effectively and driven, kettled into Europe. So what we are really discussing is nothing short of a genocide. We've looked at this history, looked at its culmination in the late 15th century, by which time the last remaining Yashraelites were essentially kettled into Spain and Portugal, being the last bastion nations that hadn't then addressed the Yashraelite problem, or the issue of our peoples, brown peoples, living in their lands. So we had really in these lands made significant contributions and strides to supposed Western civilization, which really did help to renew the West, essentially, help it to stand on its feet. It wasn't doing so really at the time of our initial exile into its lands. And we see how they really were rewarded. So not only the erasure of a peoples, but the subsequent replacement also. Because we've looked at the whole issue that the actual, identification of those who say that they are the Jews, the Jewish peoples, is also in many ways used to actually conceal this wider history. Because of course it can't be denied. It's very, very prevalent or very, very apparent from the historical records that our peoples were in these lands. That can't be denied. So this, the Jewish identity is used in many ways, whether the Jewish people like me saying that or not. I'm not meaning to be offensive here, but this is just a fact. It's just the way that it is. So also the replacement, not only of our theology in very, very real ways, because we've also seen, well, then what then subsequently happened, how Rome then essentially, well, said they had an epiphany, really. Apparently Constantine saw a symbol of a cross and was actually told by this symbol he would conquer. Then he subsequently converted the actual power of the actual military machine of Rome into the softer power of a church, essentially. Then became a religio-political system that then migrated its capital into Asia for a time. Why? To essentially pursue the glory of the early churches, the 7 early churches that were planted there. So they pursued these churches into Asia, and so they were ultimately replaced. They then migrated for a time, I believe, to France, and then ultimately back to Rome. And there are also all sorts of spiritual covenants and synergies also around all of that as well, that we could also go into, but time does not permit really in this particular video. There's a whole replacement theology also. Replacement of identity also. So we've come to actually understand in another podcast we did on our sister channel, again, Israel Diaspora Report for the Mixture from Seer, how even our temple ultimately was replaced. Because there was a location in the United Kingdom, in the centre of the city, the Corporation of London, which we know is actually part of the actual beast construct, I can only call it, one of the 3 heads of the 3-headed eagle that we have actually spoken of in our previous Sabbath session. We've looked at the actual revelations of the prophet Ezra. It's also again published on this channel. To understand how our very temple also was replaced, replete with the actual pillars of our temple. If you recall, when Solomon actually created the temple, he actually built on the inner court 2 pillars, one he called Jason, one he called Boaz. And these pillars, we've actually given the actual definition for these, but they do represent essentially divine law in a very real sense. So Edom, in trying to actually replicate these pillars and put symbols of them on the actual buildings of Temple Ba, which is also the seat of their legal system, judicial system also, is actually trying to emulate this jurisdiction, if you like, to legislate according to the laws of God, in a sense. Because the pillars represent, they represent things like God will establish. But if you want to kind of know more information about that, you have to actually look at the actual videos. I forget the actual name of the specific video, which we'd actually discussed this. But we have actually looked, I think we've looked at or touched on it in the actual podcast, the mixture from Seer, the Part 1 Temple. So if you want to know more about that, and even the reasons as to why judges in the UK wear white wigs, all again hails from Yeshurite principles and law. So yes, so those pillars are the actual ways in which they implicate law, essentially, including even within the financial system, to legislate and actually print money as well. But the temple was also a treasury, also. It was also looted by Rome. We know this also from the actual procession or the actual parade that was held in Rome in 71 AD to celebrate the conquest of Jerusalem, whereby our treasures were actually paraded through the streets, at least some of the actual artifacts from the temple. Our silver, our gold, which was also taken from the temple, which Joel does actually attest to the fact that Rome have taken Yahuwah's silver and gold. You actually realize it's his silver and his gold, because of course we are Yahuwah's people. And we believe that we have seen how part of that was actually used to pay for the actual construction of the Colosseum in Rome, which was one of the most sophisticated and complex structures of public arenas really for its day. Very, very costly to create. And of course, many of our forefathers actually died there also. And Yahuwah does actually indict this whole system as being guilty of having shed the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So again, of his people. And this whole litany of things we could go into. The whole unjust appropriation of resources, which we still see perpetuating to this very day. The carving up of Africa, essentially, the Berlin Conference in 1881. The hindering of development there. So while Africa has been allowed to develop to some extent, there's always a check on how far she's permitted to progress. The destruction, really, of and the appropriation of our communities and resources. We see that every time we try to create something, or we see what really does begin to unfold. Particularly in the US, have seen this destruction of Black Wall Street, many of the communities there. Even most disgracefully, I find quite amazing, even looking at the actual site of Lake Lanier. I understand that another death occurred there, again quite recently. And this is quite amazing to me that a peoples could really flood a black community, essentially was what they did, and then try to make it into a civic place for people to actually go and hang out and have fun there. And then wonder why all these disasters actually occur there. But anyway, so the whole really engineering really, of our communities around the creation of dysfunction, which very much is required really by this system in order for it to progress at our expense. We know that actually one of the names for this system is Meher-Shalal-Hashbaz for the beast system. And we have come to understand that means quickly to the spoil, swiftly to the plunder. And that was actually a prophecy that was given by Isaiah in the 7th century before the coming of Christ. Roughly about 30 or so years before the actual creation of Rome itself, before Rome became an actual viable nation and entity as well. It's believed he actually called this nation into being, in a sense, very, very much through that prophecy. But we're bringing really an indictment, as if that wasn't enough of an injustice to have been done to a people. The subsequent then enslavement, or re-enslavement, I can say. And slavery by, well, after a fashion, for which there's not really any name. Because we've come to actually understand in the actual video we did, looking at reparations, kind of redefining what slavery actually is. because what we actually term slavery, that actually our forefathers experienced in quite recent memory, as far as Yahuwah is concerned, isn't slavery at all. We tried to actually find a name for it. The closest we came was men stealing. But it was of a tone and of a nature for which there was no historical precedent, even in terms of the actual level of what was actually done to Yasharel. Even Yahuwah did actually say that things would befall Israel, or would not have befallen any other nation in the history of the earth. This was partly in a way in which he could be identified as well. Yahuwah did actually say that. The reason he said that is because he knew that ultimately Israel would fall into the hands of Edom. And Yahuwah, part of the actual prophecy given to Edom as a nation, part of her destiny, is that Yahuwah, as I said, well, over Edom will I cast out my shoe. So she is a nation that can be trusted to kick others about. So it did grieve Yahuwah that our people did actually fall into that category, but as we have come to see, and I've said repeatedly, our peoples are the only nation for whom a whole war is fought really in heaven over her destiny. And I really would urge the Yasharites everywhere to be attentive at this time, because if our people are still able to see, there's not a singular word that Yahuwah has spoken. He's actually written and prescribed in this book that has failed to come to pass and fulfill really on our peoples, then perhaps they're really not going to understand or see it at all. So the word of God is true. And the word of God also does speak of the deliverance of Yahuwah's people from this regime, which, as we've seen, not only perpetuated this history, but the current descendants wash their hands and absolve themselves of all responsibility for it, while renewing their covenants and binding themselves to it by many of the things they're still actively continuing to do. I mean, the actual list, a litany of crimes, I can only call it, is too numerous to mention. There's a whole subsequent, even the whitening of various nations as well. Again, to try to conceal this history and to try to conceal the kind of origin stories of nations. There's also the whole fact that with the actual removal of, or the erasure, should I call it, for want of a polite way to term a genocide, of that nation that were driven into Europe initially. There was composed a whole black nobility, some of whom were even of the royal lineage, were subsequently persecuted and violently removed and sent into exile in many cases, if they survived. And even as I see the whole renewal of all of the furore going on in the UK currently around the migrant hotels, to recognise that all of this happened historically and was a lead up to many of the actual pogroms and then the violent outbreaks that then broke out against our forefathers in previous generations. So you see the issue, which I'm saying, that the whole history essentially renewing, because of course no redress is made to it. Many aren't even aware that they are actually fulfilling these evil historical generational curses and patterns of their forefathers in doing these crimes, or of the actual nature of the judgment that essentially are inciting on their own bloodlines in doing these things as a result of that. And in any nation where there was justice, it would even be a crime to even cite such pejorative and racist terms to refer and to actually think in terms of others. So for these crimes, the co-opting again of our communities into these tabernacle systems again as well. Imagine co-opting the people of God into a tabernacle system. This is some really serious judgment, for which there will really be no escape. As they say, the whole appropriation of resources as well, which we still see playing out in Africa. And most brutally in Congo to this day, we still see, well, what is going on there, the levels of deprivation there. And governments there are unable to get themselves together at all because it's in the interests, indeed, of the West that it be scattered and just a chaos. So they can really go in and help themselves and take out what they want. And there was even an instance, I believe it was just a few years ago, where a United Nations truck overturned and was found to be full of minerals actually being smuggled out of the country. United Nations. They've just made it all just general free-for-all to assist or to help themselves, not only to the physical resources, but as we see there is also a solidical trade also in the spiritual resources also. And there are spiritual curses and covenants also associated with many of these things that have been put into place as well around the resources of our peoples, believing that we would never see or that we wouldn't know. But there is a God in heaven. So what are Israel's crimes? What are, I should say, Edom's crimes? Because I don't spare my own people either. Because we perhaps haven't done as righteously and have fallen into many traps as a consequence. But the fact still remains that Edom bear the greater sin. And even Yahuwah has said that he is very sore displeased with the nations, both with Edom and those that they have led in the global confederacy that Psalm 83 does speak of, them leading against her actually removing or wanting to remove Israel from being a people, being a nation at all. Why does Yahuwah say he's displeased? He said because he was a little bit displeased with our people because we refused to follow him as diligently as he required. But then he said that Edom really did help to really help forward the affliction. So he's saying that Edom took the actual leeway she was given over our people to a level and dimension that you had never intended or permitted them to do. So this is a part of the reason why in his return, he's coming to address these things, the confederacy and the controversy that was done to Zion, as he has said. Yashralite innovation and labor has made major contributions to Europe, to Britain particularly. Our resource was even used to even seed, as a seed capital, to seed the Industrial Revolution. As well as our ingenuity, our intellectual property was also used to even create, essentially, the iron and the steel industry. The actual techniques, the innovation as how to actually smelt iron was actually derived from the Ibo people. This is historical fact. Britain deny this, as they do, but this is historical fact, and I don't really see how they can deny it. And we see really the actual, well, hierarchy that they do their best to maintain. Any leaders or our prophets that do put their head above the parapet, they are ready to attempt to remove. But I really would caution them, really, in this occasion on seeing my coming forth, because they'll look possibly at my identity, look at my following, and see it's not that large. Well, perhaps we've learned a few things. There are millions of us who are in support of what I'm doing, who look really at your history and really wonder why the current generation of your peoples are happy to bind themselves to this I don't know what to call it, bloodshed and just abomination.